Hey, we're back. And so we're going to be talking about quickly the revolution. Now, you can see the PowerPoint that I've put onto in order for you to really see the basic elements of what I want you to know from our textbook and revolution in American politics. And so the colonists were just that. They were a colony of Great Britain. And Great Britain at the time in the 1700s and even before that had been expanding quite a bit around the world. The Dutch did it, the French did it, the Spaniards did it. And so um, the revolution here, we consider now the United States, it was just several colonies on the East Coast. And King George III was the king at the time. And one thing that many people don't know, it's hard to realize what living in a monarchical rule is like. One person is in charge, and everybody must follow these rules. Today's context in Thailand, they're run under monarchical rule, and you can't criticize the Thai king at all, whether social media or any other form, or else you'll go to jail. Now, under monarchical rule, each king will rule differently. And so some are good and some aren't so good. And King George III, I would argue, wasn't so good. He believed in colonizing around the world, where he colonized in Europe, had wars in Europe, in the Americas, and even in Asia. And so he was stretched thin. His resources were thinned out. And so between 1739 and 1763, as you can see from the outline, they were engaged in several wars, that is Great Britain, and the expansion in the Americas. In 1763, something happened. Britain's parliament passed the American Revenue Act, which was considered the sugar tax, requiring the American colonists to pay heavy taxes on sugar, raw materials, and manufactured goods from foreign countries. Other taxes followed, which gave rise to the slogan, taxation without representation. Now, a couple other slides down, I should go to that now. Some of these actions that happened during that time period really caused a huge disturbance for the American colonists. They're so far away from Great Britain, they felt like they had their own system of governance. Yes, there was monarchical rule from a distance, but they became more independent, creating more revenue, becoming very wealthy with cotton, with lumber, with tobacco. And so the 1764 Sugar Act caused duties on sugar, unlike before, coffee, tea, wine, and other imports, and expanded admiralty courts. So if the colonists didn't abide by these duties, aka also known as taxes, on sugar, coffee, and wine, and other things, they would have to face admiralty court. And some of the times those were severe. You would lose your cargo, for example, and everything you worked for, a lot of valuable stuff. And then in 1765, 1 year later, the Stamp Act, which was really a draconian act by the king, and it was so draconian they repealed it 1 year later. What it was in order to print anything, you must pay for that document. So all printed documents required a special stamp on paper purchased by the king's chosen distributor. And documents included deeds to property, which deeds, as you probably know, are recordings of lands that you own. Newspapers. So if you wanted to publish a newspaper, you had to pay the king's distributor, who would then give the king some money based on that, and even marriage licenses. So if you want to get married, the Stamp Act required you to pay extra for that. 1765, another rule called the Quartering Act, required Americans to provide housing for British troops. Imagine that. Somebody from over the Atlantic Ocean is telling you that if you had an empty place that wasn't that was vacant, that you would be required at any given time, upon notice, that you would have to house foreign soldiers. That's pretty dramatic if you are a colonist. And then in 1766, because people were very upset about the king's actions, there was the Declaratory Act, which says Parliament's rules control over colonies' rules. And that's similar to the rules we saw that we'll see at the end of the chapter called Supremacy Clause in the US Constitution. So what this Declaratory Act said was that anything that Parliament decided for the colonists must abide by. And you can imagine many parliamentarians or people in the parliament never went to the United States. So their actions were based merely on the preservation of Great Britain's ability to have economics and be strong economically. Then in 1770, we all probably heard of the Boston Massacre. It wasn't quite a massacre because only 5 Americans died by British soldiers. But back then, that was a significant act because Britain took towards violence on American colonists for really the first time. And so tensions were rising dramatically at this time period. And in 1773, one of the last severe acts was called the Tea Act, which is the East India Tea Company had a monopoly on tea sales, which really was a problem and led to basically a lot of conflict amongst the final. It was the last straw of a variety of different conflicts that caused the American Revolution to occur. And in 1775, the Prohibitory Act imposed embargoes on American goods and allowed seizure of American ships. So basically what they were saying is like, look, we're going to own all of everything that they're exporting, period. That's severe. And in 1776, that really was the last point for the Americans, and they've decided to start a revolution. I did want to go real quick go back to the 1764 American Revenue Act, where the taxation without representation phrase or slogan was created. That still exists today. If you go to Washington, D.C., their license plate, I used to have a license plate when I lived out there, and it says taxation without representation. What that means today's context in Washington, D.C. is simply because D.C. is considered a territory, they don't have a member of Congress that actually can vote on the floor. Even though they're within the border of the United States, they're not a territory like, they're a territory similar to Puerto Rico, Guam, and the Virgin Islands. And so what we find DC and other territories send members of Congress to Congress, they don't get to vote on the floor. They can vote in committee, but really they lack the power of decisive action on the floor. And so their slogan is taxation without representation. What they really want to do is to be their own state. But the reality is if you incorporate a new state, you have to have 2 new senators. So in all probability, DC will probably in the future at some point have elected with full voting powers, and that slogan, taxation without representation, hopefully will no longer be necessary. So that's the current context of that term. Let's go real quick back to the Tea Act. The Boston Tea Party led to the revocation of the Massachusetts Colonial Charter. So the king said, because Boston was not abiding by the Tea Act, we're going to revoke their charter as a colony. and it legalized British troops to be housed in unoccupied buildings in the colonies. And so this was a boiling point for action. And if you know about the Boston Tea Party, there was Americans who dressed as Native Americans and dumped out a lot of tea. And so that helped lead to the American Revolution, as you probably already know. So that's this part of the chapter. I will come back to the independence section.